Vampire the Masquerade is a long-running franchise, one that has seen card games, RPGs, video games, board games, just about every possible iteration that you can imagine. And for years, people have wanted a sequel to Bloodlines, the game, and it was announced last week that Bloodlines 2 is happening, and a lot of people were very excited about it. Now, I think if you're into Vampire the Masquerade, it's going to be hard to imagine you not playing this game for these particular reasons, but I thought it was relevant to point out some of the things that the developer has said, and the game is in fact taking a firm political stance in what they believe to be right and wrong. That's right. Can't just give people a game they love. Got to tell them what to think too. And there is a couple of threads here from the VG 24/7 interview that are probably worth going after, but let's see some of the top quotes. Well, the demo is in the early stages of the game. I saw hinted at conflict and politics of warring clans. Clooney said it's central to Bloodlines 2 that the writers are actively taking a political stance in the sequel, with the themes of art versus commerce and technological advances versus tradition. One of the reasons why the particular conflict attracted us so much is because it's inherently political conversation, but it's one of the few ones where it's hard to, there are valid approaches. The world has to move forward. Quote, it's a political game, but I think it's one of those few opportunities that gives us a chance to let people make their own political statement in a way that's not cheap. I do believe you can look at both sides of a political argument without understanding both sides. It's easy to say this is good and that is bad, but it's definitely taking some political stances on what we think is right and wrong. In terms of the main conflict, what is interesting is that one of those truly balanced issues. I doubt it. I doubt it. It's not just politics, where Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 takes a progressive approach. Quote, the character creator, which players get to use twice, once at the start to define your human aspects and later at a second time to flesh out your vampire, goes way beyond basic male and female females. Body type, gender, pronouns, employment history, and fashion can all be toyed with for a very modular build. Again, the pronouns thing, fine, who cares? It appeals to like 0.7% of the population. And when we're also talking about creating a fictional character, it's not, this is the time to experiment with that kind of stuff, I suppose. We're interested in providing a very robust role-playing experience for the player with something where they can identify with their character by fine-tuning and providing lots of options for that. In the first game, you will start out by picking a clan. With Bloodlines 2, you're starting as a Thin Blood. We give you some background to what your human self was before being embraced, but don't so much have a direct influence on the gameplay. There are a few minor influences like dialogue options, but we're really interested in following the progression and having the roleplay experience for the player get a handle on the side of the game before they get a handle on the political clan-oriented side of it. Interesting. It's called the Masquerade, so if you eat a human in public and turn into a bat in front of a bar, you'll get in trouble, not only with the police, but also with some beefier supernatural watchdogs. This humanity system returns, so killing innocents bring you closer to the inner beast in first person, but yeah, you could customize your character, including choosing pronouns separately from your body type. Again, not a big deal. But it's interesting. It was very of its time, Allison said. It approached certain topics differently. How we look at stuff has matured since then. It's 15 years later and things have changed, Minnesota said. This is on their Twitch stream, I believe. We have to be very sensitive about how we handle things like mental illness. That was a concern for us and for Paradox, and how we make a mature story. But if we do anything, we do our homework to make sure that we are punching up, not punching down. We talk about these issues constantly. Well, because it's the only thing that matters to certain people. Because we care about including people, want to make them feel powerful and sexy. We don't want them to feel like it's not for them. Now, if we look how Billy D over at One Angry Gamer is covering it, now his takes are generally a little more spicy. He'll say, if you're excited about the upcoming Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, which is currently in development by Hardsuit Labs and Paradox Interactive, with a scheduled release for the first quarter of 2020 on multiple consoles, Steam, GOG, Paradox Store, and the Epic Games Store, you might want to bottle up the excitement in a jar, slap it on a shelf, close your cupboard, lock it up tight, because there's a huge socio-political uphill climb to get over before you can safely say that the game will actually be worth playing. And this is what I've talked about many times. Like, if it fits the storyline of the game and doesn't necessarily put it in your face about who's right and who's wrong, and allows the user to kind of make up their own mind, I don't mind it. It's generally the games that have some political leanings that also employ the type of people that attack their fan base and make their company look bad. In their piece, they reveal that the character creation has pronoun selector, which only ever popular with SJW game developers. That's true. Like the Harebrained Schemes Battletech, which went out of its way to prevent players from making white characters. Most centrists TM would ignore this. I consider myself a centrist TM, so I'm not ignoring it because it says something they've been programmed to do by liberal media. Everyone else with common sense will have seen red flags raised. I think that there are red flags here, but also let's not ignore that Vampire the Masquerade is an RPG. It is in like the character build sheet. If my spider sense could be at a minimal level, it would be this, because it's generally, I mean, a character creator, you're creating, you should have basically unending opportunities, unending options in character creators. The pronoun things obviously is only important to a small group of people, but you know, there's that. However, it gets worse, as explained in VG 24/7 piece. The game will be themed around modern-day Seattle politics, with creative director Martin Clooney explaining. One of the reasons we went to Seattle in Bloodline 2 is there is a lot of conflict in Seattle that is a microcosm of a lot of conflict that's going on all over the place. It just felt like a good place to start the ground it. The conflict between tradition and progress. Maybe Republicans and Democrats, or traditionals and progressives. Conflict between money and artistic endeavors. A lot of these conflicts are happening right now, and they're very real. Seattle is, in my opinion, not a great place to be living right now, but that's neither here nor there. It seems like the perfect place to dig into something that feels very modern in terms of the conflict and also very timeless, grounding it in 2020, but also much of the descendant of what the original game was. One wonders if they're going to have Drumpf in the game. I get the feeling they will. Some caricature of him. One of the reasons why particular conflict attracted us so much was because it's inherently political conversation, but it's one that has few ones where it's hard to. There's valid approaches. The world has to move forward. It's a political game. Now, if the pronouns wasn't much of a giveaway and the politics issue didn't seem to sway you much, maybe learning that the game was designed to subvert masculinity is enough to wake you up. Now, this one is an issue. In an article published on RPS, it was revealed that the game will retain its sexiness, but a more so oriented way from the masculine power fantasy. Senior writer Kara Allison, someone who has long been storied overlapping story with the anti-Gamergate side, and the person responsible for Hotline Miami 2 cutting a particularly spicy scene. It effectively got it banned in Australia. Both explained and was paraphrased by RPS to outline the game's socio-political approach to gender representation. I often look at it like, how would somebody feel sexy in a situation, she explained, and that there are definitely characters in there that will be shipped like mad. Everyone in the studio, yeah, I would definitely go for that. He's my bae kind of stuff. Who even talks like that? They're often very unusual choices. She's also said that they're trying to broaden Bloodlines 2 away from a more masculine power fantasy of the original, so it appeals to way more people this time. Now, I don't know that it didn't appeal to some people because of the way it was before, but it will be interesting. I mean, ultimately, I just want it to be a good game. If you're unable to watch the clip, again, Allison states, I feel like the politics have changed, obviously, so I think the first game was kind of its time, so now the politics have moved on, so we're trying to write the politics of now. why write any politics? So there are a lot of more kind of things that have changed on the topic we might discuss. We would totally push differently from the first one. So we've been thinking of that too. It's interesting. It's interesting. Now, a lot of people who will say politics are in everything. You know, to say you don't want politics is absurd. It's impossible. This is what like Yim Sterling would say. I think there is some truth to that. I think at least when I say I don't want politics in my video games, I don't mean that the existence of like a Senate or like a vote is what I don't want in a video game. What I don't want my video games to do is to push particularly one side over the other, or use it to push a narrative. That is where I get concerned. The fact that the Division 2 takes place in Washington, D.C. is not a problem for me. Now, if the game were to come out and say, you know, specific things about Orange Man bad or Hillbot good or something like that, where it's more on the nose, those are the games that I have a problem with. If it presents things in an artistic way or a fair light and people can make their own judgments from that, I tend to not really have a problem with it. It usually is the developers of these games that end up ruining it for me more so than the game itself. Well, I mean, coming out and saying Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, it's definitely taking political stances on what we think are right and wrong, is a good way to, I would guess, turn people off. You're obviously getting a lot of people memeing on them for this. You're getting a lot of people getting banned from Steam pages because of this. I've had several people reach out about being banned. 15 years later, the vampires are still at each other's throats. Vampires the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 begins as the previous game did way back in 2004. Your newborn vampire, confused, taunted about what about to be executed. You stand in a kangaroo court without being various bickering vampire clans prodding you for information. Yes. All good things. You could call it a retroactive borrowing, says Martin Clooney, creative director, developer, Hardsuit Labs. Bloodlines is at a time very much an RPG. It influences on immersion sims and was important, but we didn't change the fact as its core action was an RPG. We loaned it out for a bit, but now we're stealing it back. Again, I thought the original one was pretty cool, and I am a fan of the franchise. I did the RPG way back in the day, probably 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Definitely played the card game for a little while, one of those cool dead card games that I have in my collection. But it's interesting that you're coming out and saying it is a political game. But I think it's one of those few opportunities that gives us a chance to let people make their own political statement in a way that's not cheap. I don't believe that you can look at both sides of a political argument without understanding both sides. It's easy to say this is good and that's bad, but it's definitely taking some political stances on what we think are right and wrong. In terms of the main conflict, what is interesting, it's one of those truly balanced issues. I think this statement itself is in conflict with itself. You say that you can look at both sides and let the player decide. However, you're also saying that you are telling them you believe what you believe is right and wrong. And you talk about, as much as I loved being in Seattle in the 90s, I've lived most of Seattle most of my life, but at the same time, I make video games for a living. I'm not innocent of the tech boom. Talking about technological progress is a big deal. People are going to make money doing it, but at what cost? And I think these are probably fine topics to discuss. Body type, gender pronouns, employment history, fashion. This is important to a tiny percent of the player base, I think. Hopefully the game itself will be good as it stands. The thing is, when you discuss this type of stuff, right? When you come out a year before the game is even out and you're openly saying, hey, look, we think we know what's right and what's wrong, and we're going to put that in the game before anyone's ever even played the game, that's an issue for me. I think if the game is good and this ends up being a tiny part of it, then I don't think it matters. But usually when you end up with games that, are trying to push political ideologies and push what they believe is right and wrong, then you end up with developers that attack fandoms, you end up with huge block lists, you end up going to war with your fans, you end up making weird statements about how games are inherently political, and you must embrace the politics, not only that are in the game, but you must agree with them because we've decided that's what's correct. I know, obviously, you could just not play the game. It'll be interesting to watch Vampire the Masquerade's Woke Vampire Bloodlines edition because I'm going to bet that you're going to see a battle between developers and fans before the game comes out. You're going to see even more woke articles. But if not, maybe the game will turn out to be just great. If it turns out that the company is full of people that hate the fandom and hate gamers, well, then it'll be just another game that I skip. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about woke vampires and Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines 2, about developers getting woke, and I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll talk to you again real soon.